Administration and its critics are right that there is a scandal here. The congressional investigation that is now beginning to play out is needed, if only to tell us the exact dimensions of this scandal and what shape any reform or congressional oversight might take. I want to bring in Liz Kennedy, counsel at the progressive think tank Demos, working on money and politics, Mark Elias, Democratic election attorney with Perkins Coie and chairman of the firm's political law group, Carl Smith, assistant professor of public economics and government at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He also writes for the Modeled Behavior blog at Forbes.com. And Kim Barker, reporter with the investigative website ProPublica. So there have been some developments basically in the last 2 days. There's sort of this, I don't know, game going on here where Republicans want to make it seem like, oh, the Obama administration knew all about this, knew that there was the IRS was going after, was singling out Tea Party groups, right-wing groups before the 2012 election and didn't say anything about it. Now we have news that the Republican chairman of the Oversight Committee actually requested the investigation and probably knew the same thing as the Obama administration. Probably more to come out here, but right now my reading on this is sort of everybody knew there was some kind of probe going on, and that might be about the limit of it.
Well, I mean, last year, in the beginning of the year, Tea Party groups were very open about the fact they felt like they were being persecuted by the IRS. They came out, they told members of Congress talked about it openly. So this was no secret to anybody. I mean, the fact that there was this probe going on, the fact that the groups had complained about it. In fact, an investigation was requested early last year, right?
Yeah. I think it's entirely proper that people, we are now aware that people were informed that this investigation was moving forward, but it's entirely proper that people were waiting to hear the results of the investigation. And in fact, what we learned is that obviously it is unacceptable that any actual names that would reflect, presumed policy positions were used to weed out these groups, because that is an un-American, type of targeting. However, what we're just seeing is that this really overwhelmed office was seeking to apply the law as they are charged to do, and the number of groups were shooting up, and that they were trying to use kind of bureaucratic shorthand to get in. As soon as anyone in Washington heard about any kind of, actual viewpoint things, they were told to stop doing it. And then, in fact, these officials in the Cincinnati office then reapplied this kind of targeted thing for review. It really looks like this office itself was kind of more like Keystone Cops than Big Brother in terms of what these real reviews looked for. We find only a third of the 300 groups subjected for special review actually had these Tea Party names. Other progressive groups were also reviewed. And it's the real issue is that the 501c4s and 501c3s are actually getting involved in political campaign activity, and the IRS is charged with making sure that these groups aren't abusing the tax laws.
But it is, I mean, we have the case of a progressive group that lost its 501c4 status, but at this point, the only sort of group we know really was kind of singled out by the criteria. You can argue there were logical reasons for doing so, but it was conservative groups disproportionately, at least as far as we know right now, that they were.
But also the criteria said any group that had advocated the expansion of government, which is pretty much going to be a liberal group. But nobody's come out and said, yes, I was one of those groups. You just have lawyers saying that, I represent clients that were targeted.
I agree. We learned two things that are significant in terms of systemic failure. Number one, as the president has said, as you just said, it is completely unacceptable. It's outrageous that the IRS would target or politically profile groups based on their ideology or based on what candidates they support. It's unacceptable. That has to be dealt with, and that's a separate issue. The second, though, is an important systemic failure about how the IRS operates. And it has been in this area of 501cs generally and 501c4s in particular, completely opaque. If you look at its report, if you look at the IG report, and you look at the reaction of the IRS, they go back to, well, these all have to be judged based on facts and circumstances. If the IRS were more transparent and provided clear guidelines, what is it that a 501c4 can do that is social welfare? What is political intervention? What does primary purpose mean? If it laid out those lines in clear public forum, then the groups that want to do everything right would have guideposts to do it. And those who want to monitor to make sure their groups are doing everything right would have guideposts to hold them accountable to. But what we learned is that not just that it was the Keystone Cops, but that basically it was a bunch of low-level IRS people holding up an application saying, looks like social welfare to me, looks like political intervention to me, and that's not a standard that we should want to have.
The thing about it, though, is that even though it gives guideposts for people who do the right thing, it gives guideposts for people who do the wrong thing. So if you're outlining exactly, specifically what this means, this is also telling you you exactly how to structure loopholes to get around it, or structure organizations that are officially within the law but violate the spirit of the law. And so that's what people always complain about, right? That there are all these groups getting around. It's hard. Why isn't law common sense? But when people try to do it in a common sense way, this is what happens.
Well, there's common sense way.
Well, that's the issue. That's the issue here. The idea that this has fallen through the evolution of campaign finance, that this has fallen to the IRS, and the IRS is clearly, or was clearly, woefully unprepared to deal with this latest evolution of the campaign finance system. I want to talk about how we got to this, what the IRS can do, and if the IRS should be doing anything at all when we come back. So there are all sorts of issues sort of within the IRS. The New York Times has a story today about just how woefully understaffed the office is in Cincinnati. It's been handling this. There's issues with Lois Lerner, who is in charge of this portion of the IRS. You know, she leaked this by planting a question at a news conference. That's part of the news. So there's a lot there. But I want to talk about what I think sort of the bigger scandal of this sort of is the evolution of the campaign finance system has brought us to the proliferation of these groups, these 501c4s. These are groups that are under the tax code supposed to be primarily engaged in social welfare. There's social welfare groups that, you know, basically they can have some political involvement, but it's not defined what some political involvement means. And so this is, here's an example. You've probably seen it, but this is a social welfare group in a political ad last year.
Tax-raising politician Tim Kaine backs cap and trade, which has been called a huge tax, raising energy bills for families, putting over 50,000 Virginia jobs at risk.
Cap and trade policies will kill Virginia jobs. What people don't understand is the impact it's going to have to the working families in this country. This energy tax can kill 1,400 jobs at this company.
Tim Kaine's for cap and trade, and that would cost jobs.
Defeat Tim Kaine for U.S. Senate. That's Karl Rove's group, and this is a social welfare group. This is what the evolution of the campaign finance system has brought us. So in terms of, you know, looking for solutions to where we are right now, I mean, I'll go through a couple of proposals. I'll put one on the table. Lawrence O'Donnell talked about it this week. Right now, the enforcement is these groups have to be primarily engaged in social welfare. They can, but there can be political involvement. What if we just said 501c4s can have no political involvement whatsoever?
Yes, that's absolutely an acceptable proposal. I think we have to take a step back, as you were saying, and look at the fact that Citizens United changed the rules of the game in terms of political spending and what's currently allowed. And yet, none of the rules of the game have really changed to keep up with the situation we're currently in. So that's why you see so many C4s now set up to accept. C4s are corporations that previously weren't allowed to spend directly to influence elections, but now are. The Supreme Court, when they allowed this money to go in, assumed it would be disclosed, and yet it's not. So the Congress can take some really common sense steps to pass entirely disclosure legislation that would disincentivize people from setting up these C4 groups, which can serve as these vehicles for dark money. C4 groups spent $250 million on those types of ads in the 2012 election without telling the American public who was funding their sources. So that's the real scandal here. But we can have disclosure legislation. You can bar C4s that are set up as exclusive social welfare organizations. That's the statutory language. They're supposed to be exclusively for social welfare purposes, even more than just primarily. Or you could set a really low threshold to say, okay, C3's absolute bar on campaign activity, C4's perhaps a low threshold, 5 to 10%, or some dollar amount. That was a bright line test to enable the IRS to more easily enforce this law more clearly without currently it's required to look at the totality of spending to see if they've reached this majority level. It's a mess.
Let me address your proposal. Let's say you did something like that. Right. I think the problem there is you have some group that's interested in breast cancer mammograms for poor people. They depend a lot on public funding. That public funding is getting cut, and now they want to say something about it, right? You know, we think what we do is really important. We think we're saving people's lives. They're clearly think of themselves, and the community would think of them as trying to.
They are a social welfare group. They really are, yeah.
But now now they have a political message. Are they then cut off? I mean, do they get their, are they subject to prosecution for saying, no, we think people should spend money, or we think the government should support this cause?
And it's never going to happen. I mean, the Supreme Court said in the Citizens United decision that nonprofits, corporations, and unions can spend money on politics unless the Supreme Court comes in there, or you get some sort of act of Congress, or the IRS actually were to come out and want to say, if they just published a regulation, they could say no more money spent on on political advertising, but they don't seem
and remember
that gets me to the point with the Supreme Court setting basically setting the rules that they've set for the
even before Citizens United, nonprofits could spend money on politics, and they did, and that often gets lost in the whole, like, because it's so complicated.
Which brings me to another proposal that I want to put on the table that I doubt it'll ever happen, but I want to put it out there after this. Hello from New York. I'm Steve Kornacki here with Liz Kennedy from the progressive think tank Demos, Mark Elias with the law firm Perkins Cole, Carl Smith from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Kim Barker with the investigative website ProPublica. So I said I was going to put another proposal on the table, and this one I'm going to give credit to Jonathan Bernstein, who's a political scientist, wrote a piece for the American Prospect this week basically called How to Fix the IRS Mess. And he said at the root of all of this really is a basic problem, that is, or basic issue. As the Supreme Court has said in two rulings over the last 35 years or so, first of all, that money equals free speech, and second, that corporations can give money to elections. So if you have that, and then you look at the evolution of campaign finance reform law over the last generation or so, where it basically it's been an attempt to move political money away from candidates, away from campaigns, and away from parties. So you had soft money originally. Remember, you had these 527s about a decade ago after McCain-Feingold. Now the new loophole that Karl Rove and all these other folks exploit are these 501c4s. So if you patch up somehow the 501c4, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. It just goes somewhere else. So what Bernstein proposed is, he said, let's admit that this money right now, because of the Supreme Court, it's out there and it's going to find a way into the system. Let's let it go back to the campaigns. Let's let it be unlimited. It goes to the campaigns. It's fully disclosed, and there's public financing.
Well, I want to take up before we last topic. I want to take up the proposal.
We have an hour.
I want to take up the proposal though you raised before, which is that the Democrats in Congress proposed a Disclose Act. You know, there was a time where disclosure was a bipartisan solution. Remember, 527s used to not disclose. Then there was a 527 disclosure bill, which was a bipartisan bill. It was supported by Democrats and Republicans alike through Congress. Democrats proposed the Disclose Act last Congress as a way to disincentivize one type of tax entity versus another, whether it's a 527 or a 501c4 or a taxable nonprofit or a 501c6. It would create a relatively equal playing field, and money would be disclosed. And I think, and remember, in Citizens United, the Supreme Court upheld 8-to-1 disclosure as possible. And in a later case, Doe versus Reed, disclosure was again upheld in the ballot initiative context. So I don't think you ought to, before you move to the more radical solutions, I don't think you ought to leave the topic of disclosure and just throw your hands